Today, everyone can agree that intermittent renewables cannot go on their own and that battery energy storage systems, or BESS, as the most flexible and versatile storage option out there, are a key enabler of the energy transition. In the words of the European Commission's Kadri Simpson, the Commissioner for Energy, storage is the centerpiece for building a decarbonized, flexible, and cost-effective energy system in the old continent. But before we get too excited about BESS prospects in Europe, it is also important to consider some significant challenges. From battery prices to supply chain disruptions, policy and regulatory hurdles, perplexing market price signals, there are many aspects to be considered when investing in and developing BESS in Europe. Not least, there is a long list of considerations when collocating BESS with solar PV. All this and more in the next 60 minutes. I'm Marija Maisch, editor at PV Magazine Global, and welcome to this All About Storage session of Roundtables Europe. Battery prices are a charged up topic, just as hot as the potential for localized manufacturing and how this can change the equation for battery energy storage costs. To discuss these trends, we are joined by an excellent lineup of speakers: Max Reid, Principal Analyst, EV and Battery Supply Chain Service at Mackenzie; Aaron Wade, Head of Battery Costs at CRU; and Evan Hartley, Senior Analyst at Benchmark Mineral Intelligence. A warm welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us today for what is surely to be a lively discussion. Max, over the past couple of years, battery prices have been on a roller coaster. What were the main reasons behind these turbulences?
Sure, thank you very much for having me. So yes, since say 2020 or so, the movement of battery prices has been incredibly interesting. Now, predominantly, these have been driven by the EV market. We've seen huge increases in EV uptake, primarily from China, but still energy storage systems and BESS, as you said, take up a significant portion of demand too. So really, looking at the key battery raw materials that we look at in Wood Mackenzie, so lithium, cobalt, nickel, graphite, manganese, these all saw doubling or even, I mean, in lithium's case, significant increase from about $10 a kilogram for lithium chemical up to $60, $70, or $80 a kilogram in the space of half a year over 2021 to 2022. And we saw those prices sustain over the 2022 period. Now, this really highlighted the fact that hurdles and bottlenecks within the what is quite a nascent industry, certainly in the supply chain aspect, can have an impact on spot prices. And it is very important to note that these are spot prices rather than what a lot of consumers or producers will be paying for material, but still, it was this sort of short and sharp increase in EV demand primarily. So in China, demand for sales of EVs increased from about 150,000 units in January of 2021 to nearly 500,000 in December 2021. Increasing by 5 times over the year. And the supply sector just wasn't able to ramp up in that short time frame, as we've seen across the supply chain as well. So hence that short, sharp shock in terms of prices that I said sustained over 2022, that certainly has now come down as the supply market has responded. We've seen large increases in supply globally for these key battery raw materials, and prices are coming down. But still, with increasing demand globally and increasing localization of supply chains, we can expect demand exhibited on a sort of local area to ramp up again in the near future.
Okay, thanks, Max, for that. So, as we just heard, battery prices are now again on a downward trajectory. Aaron, are they expected to stay there, and for how long?
Yep. So, if we think about what drives the cost of a battery, it's raw materials, and of the raw materials, it's the cathode active material that really drives this cost. It's about 50% of the total cost to produce a battery comes from the cathode. And then of the cathode, depending on the chemistry, but if we look at NMC, nickel manganese cobalt oxide, or LFP, which is lithium iron phosphate, lithium is really, again, the driving cost. So as Max was saying, the price of lithium skyrocketed in the past and is coming back down. And what we at CRU expect is this price of lithium to continue to come down, to stay down over the decade due to a adequate supply to meet the increased demand. And if we think that the lithium price is going to stay low and stay not at that $10 a kilo range, but maybe 20 to 30, then the cost of our batteries will continue to come down and stay low through this period, if we look at kind of the average global cost to produce.
So in the number of years, for how many years we can expect a downward trend looking forward?
So we'd say the cost will continue to come down in the short term, so in the next couple of years, and then stabilize and stay relatively constant. But then we'll see improvements in battery technology. So we may see movement from LFP to LMFP. So if we add manganese into our battery, we can increase the operating voltage. Doing so will increase the energy, but not really increase the material cost. Therefore, your use continue to come down through these technology innovations.
Okay, Evan, do you agree with these projections? So, do you also expect the prices to go down? Are we in for a steep or gradual decline?
I think obviously the prices have come down in quite a steep fashion over the last or across this year. Looking forward to the next decade, I think perhaps to touch on something that the others haven't. There's going to be quite a focus, particularly in markets outside of China, on the contributions to the battery price that come from things like labor and the capital intensity required to build the factories at the scale required to meet the supply chain's demands. So I know obviously we're trying to focus today a little bit on Europe, but to take some lessons from the US market from this past year, where we've seen recently the cost of labor in sort of some of the battery manufacturing companies jumped by 25%, and the sort of capital required to set up what are in the grand scheme of things fairly modest battery gigafactories. With the price of lithium and other raw materials coming down, the sort of price or the attributable price within the battery to labor and sort of capex will rise just relative to the raw material prices. So I think one place we could see changes or sort of jumps in the price will come from the raw material, not the raw material price, sorry, from sort of inputs outside of the direct supply chain, the material supply chain.
Yeah, and Max, would you agree with this? Is there anything that could reverse the price fall, say, in the next 5 years from now?
Sure. Yeah, as I suppose as both my panelist guests have mentioned as well, certainly Aaron on the raw material side. So, yeah, depending on the battery technology that goes into a BESS system, with LFP sort of taking over the majority globally, then still raw materials do make up a significant portion of that price demand. I'd say certainly on the gigafactory side, as the market matures we're now at the 1 terawatt hour scale in terms of production capacity this year. This will swiftly increase into the 3 terawatt hour towards the end of the decade. I suspect that when gigafactories do reach higher levels of production and there's greater experience and maturity around producing cells, then there will be some cost reduction across the gigafactory scale, aside from that capex and the labor point that Aaron mentioned. In terms of the raw material side, we do expect to see this, I suppose, healthy period for supply for key raw materials. So lithium and nickel, certainly. We've seen a lot of nickel come online in the last couple of years, primarily from Chinese investment and some Western investment in Indonesian plants that have astoundingly come online in the space of about 2 years or so and ramped up production. And so we expect to see this surplus on a global scale for nickel. And a similar story can be said with lithium. A lot of Australian producers have expanded their current mines. New lithium is popping up from Africa, and China has the ability to expand its lepidolite production when and as it sees fit, and then also the brines in South America. And so essentially, yes, we're seeing a relatively healthy period for raw material prices for the next 4 years or so. We still expect to see some tightness towards the end of this decade, where raw material prices can tend to increase again, depending on the rate of investment that we see at the moment. Now, that is on a global scale. When we are thinking about, say, the European specific supply chain and a greater desire to localize that, we might expect to see these sort of localized differences in prices. So if you're looking at, say, a mine, say a graphite mine in Scandinavia, the production costs are certainly going to be higher than a graphite mine in China. And if cell producers are going to tend towards the localized supply chain, then we could actually see, say, a European cell cost be higher than that of certainly China, but still see increases shorter on the horizon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Max, you just mentioned graphite. Evan, this one goes to you. As of December 1st, China is requiring special export permits for graphite, and since it is dominating more than 90% of the global supply chain for this raw material, what does it mean for the prices? Will it have any impact also on the procurement in Europe?
I mean, in the sort of near term, we've already seen exports of graphite increase ahead of the announcement, or sort of just after the announcement, as the market players look to stock up on material ahead of the implementation of this policy. So where prices were falling in the sort of China market and thus the global market, we actually now see them experiencing a slight uptick, really not that much, but enough to say that the prices for graphite are currently relatively stable. But that's more a short-term thing under the increase in demand for exported material. But it's likely that, of course, these export volumes will experience a drop-off for a few months after the implementation of the regulations. What that means for Europe really isn't too much right now, because a lot of the anode material that's consumed by battery producers in Europe is purchased outright, and not there's not that much anode production at scale in Europe, or enough at least to meet the demand from the existing and sort of future battery supply chain. We're definitely seeing on the anode side of the midstream a real sort of localized deficit moving towards the end of the decade, where Europe is definitely scaling up its battery production, but less so the anode side of things. On anode exports, China already has had export license regulations in the past on this, so the new announcements or the new regulation will have a fairly minimal impact, we think, in terms of anode material exported from China. And there are potential impacts for the sort of Japanese, South Korean market in terms of spherical graphite exports that would then be processed into anode material. But the government of China have already begun talks with the South Korean government to, I guess, mitigate any supply chain issues that might result from this.
Okay, so things are looking bright on the raw material side of the story, and battery prices are expected to go down in the years to come. So, Aaron, is there still room left for alternative lithium-ion chemistries? And will they ever claim a more sizable share of the market? What are the expectations there?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that is being researched and looked into globally. So lithium-ion, obviously, we expect the prices to fall, but there may and possibly will be spikes in these specifically lithium pricing, which could trigger more investment into something like sodium-ion. So sodium-ion is currently being really heavily researched, particularly in China, as an alternative for stationary energy storage primarily. Because sodium is a heavier element than lithium, its energy density isn't quite as good. However, it potentially is safer and has just as good of a lifetime as something like an LFP cell. So we're seeing at least 14, probably up to 20 companies over in China really researching this and starting to develop both their technology and the supply chain. Sodium-ion, so lithium-ion, the cost driver is in the cathode and the lithium, whereas in sodium-ion, currently the cost driver is really focused on the anode side. So instead of graphite, we use something called hard carbon, and there's currently really no major supply chain for this. So in the short term, a sodium-ion battery technology is likely to be more expensive, but as that supply chain mobilizes and as more and more people start to produce these cells at kind of a greater volume, we expect the price of hard carbon to decrease and then sodium-ion to be cheaper than lithium-ion in the longer run, and therefore has a good chance of taking significant market share, particularly in the stationary storage space where the energy density of your cells is much less important, and you may be focused more on cycle life or safety. And here we think sodium-ion has a really good opportunity to displace some of those lithium-ion cells.
And are we talking beyond 2030 for sodium-ion to play a more significant role, or even sooner?
Sooner than that. So we expect mass production to start in the next few years. And then obviously, US installers, and I would guess that European installers as well, would probably be hesitant to install sodium-ion in the first instance. But towards the end of the decade, we expect to see sodium-ion cells coming in and being used across these installations.
Yeah, indeed, promising. And let's turn our focus to Europe now. What can we expect in terms of battery demand in Europe, and to what extent can this be covered by homegrown batteries? Max, I think you prepared also a slide for us on this one. Can you share your thoughts, please?
No, absolutely. So in terms of the work that we do at Mackenzie, so we look at across all of, say, the renewable space, electric vehicles, as we mentioned, all of these parts that are driving battery demand, and then covering across the battery supply chain. So looking at the raw materials and the midstream that I've shown here. So in terms of the share of battery demand within Europe, so this is Europe as a region, obviously, most of it will come from electric vehicles. We expect, obviously healthy growth of that side. So this 100% here is equating to around 700 gigawatt hours worth of battery demand. And in terms of the ability to meet that demand within Europe is actually looking quite difficult. So partly this is because of the fact that demand is just purely outstripping the rate of growth of gigafactory announcements. We've seen healthy interest in building gigafactories, but some significant delays and obstructions to building out that supply. I think British Volt's a very good example of that side. But still, we expect that 39% or so in terms of supply. So that's taking a healthy capacity of around 400 gigawatt hours worth, and risking that just as gigafactories don't operate at full capacity all the time. But looking further upstream from that, so that is looking at the key components that go into batteries, so cathode and anode. Again, very limited supply coming from the region to meet that demand, and then certainly in the lithium space. So this was looking at lithium for both LFP and the nickel-based cathodes. And probably interesting to note is that cathode supply share between nickel-based, so the NMCs that people know about, and iron-based, which is the LFP. And really the vast majority of announced projects and facilities will be producing nickel-based, which again, to feed the EV market, and some and Freya is a very good example up in Norway to feed the energy storage system, the BESS market. But yeah, still, therefore, a lot of these batteries are therefore going to have to be imported, or even the end use products that we're seeing with EVs to be imported from abroad.
Absolutely. So there's still, we will be relying on imports to quite a broad extent in the years to come. But so also the Europe's pipeline of gigafactories has been growing in leaps and bounds. We cannot deny that, but so has the number of setbacks and project cancellations. Evan, what are the key challenges that these projects are facing in Europe?
Yeah, thanks. There's a number of challenges that are coming up, not just in Europe but globally, and particularly in the West. And it's been alluded to in this discussion so far. But part of that is just natural. It comes from the fact that whereas in China, where the market has been up and running for many years now, 5-10 years now, and particularly matured in the last 5. Europe and North America are just growing this industry. It's going to take a number of years to get to a point where it's seamless, where there are few delays, few setbacks, and everything is sort of going well. So some of the key challenges, and Max spoke there about British Volt, but these challenges will be faced, I think, by all, by what Benchmark would consider tier 1 producers, so those who are very mature market players who supply a number of the key Western automakers. The challenges that will come up will be things like, and I mentioned this earlier, labor, particularly building a skilled workforce, building a workforce that is able to not just sort of work in one factory, but allow for other battery factories to be built around it, or sort of sustain multiple companies operating in a space, and that's both homegrown companies and those coming in from China or Asia. So the way that this can be combated is by building things, what we might consider battery hubs. So in places like Debrecen in Hungary, where you have a number of companies setting up both production facilities in the midstream and on the cell side in the downstream. And then also recently we've seen a lot of investment into northern France on the sort of cell production side, but again also the midstream. Building these hubs allows for a bit of resilience and when it comes to sourcing labor, and also building out the sort of skilled knowledge that's necessary. And on that note as well, we see a lot of delays coming from perhaps just the inexperience of local construction companies. It's quite a technical task to build one of these factories. In China, if you want to build a new factory, it's quite easy to go with sort of construction groups that have done this for many years. They know exactly what they're doing, and likely they're following the blueprint that you gave them last time or the time before. Here in Europe, it's not so simple. And we see delays because of this in Germany, in Hungary, and that's sort of combined with the perhaps stricter environmental regulations that we have. So actually, just a few days ago, one of the environmental permits for CATL's planned 100 gigawatt hour factory in Debrecen was actually annulled. So there's ongoing processes there, even where prior to that it looked like things were going okay. So there's a number of setbacks that can occur, sort of even if you think away from the actual manufacturing of the batteries themselves, but just the actual setup of these facilities.
Absolutely. And Aaron, how uncoupled can we get from other regions in terms of battery production, of any type of battery chemistry? Can we go on our own?
I think this is a great question, and we've seen different companies take different approaches to this. So some are working with Chinese, South Korean, Japanese companies to produce gigafactories through joint ventures and collective agreements. So these factories and these production bases really benefit from lots of advantages, but one really significant one is improvement of the yield. So when you start to build your batteries, especially if you've never done this before, your yield rate in your factory maybe 50-60%. So maybe up to half of the batteries you produce or the materials you originally looked to use don't make it into the final batteries. So this obviously is going to massively drive up the costs in the short term. And then partnering with these experienced companies from other countries can really help drive those yields down. However, with that being said, that's not necessary and required. And there are lots of companies in Europe who are looking to do this themselves, either from taking experienced people in these previous companies and employing them, and using these learnings to kind of help develop homegrown batteries. If you look at Northvolt, for example, they're making moves throughout the supply chain.
Yeah.
So they're working with companies to do refining of lithium. So there you can purchase lithium or some processed lithium from spodumene, refine that yourself in Europe, produce your CAM yourself, produce your cells yourself. So from that sense, you can really separate yourself from the other countries. And then if you have the in-house experience to produce good batteries at high yield rates, then it's possible for Europe, but it will be challenging, and the costs in the short term will definitely be higher doing it this way.
Okay, and I think this is a great place to wrap up for today. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your insights. These were Max Reid, Principal Analyst at Wood Mackenzie, Aaron Wade, Head of Battery Costs at CRU, and Evan Hartley, Senior Analyst at Benchmark Mineral Intelligence. It was a pleasure to discuss these trends with them. As we just heard, falling raw material prices and significant growth in production capacity across the value chain have seen battery prices return to a downward trajectory in 2023. But there is another equally powerful factor at play behind falling battery prices, and that's technological innovation. Joining us to discuss the latest trends in battery design and where opportunities for good margins still exist is Winfried Wahl, Senior Director at Hithium Energy Storage. Hello, Winfried. Welcome. It's good to see you here.
Hello, good morning, Marija. Nice to meet you.
Winfried, Hithium is a newcomer to the global battery market, but has ambitious plans to expand its manufacturing capacity up to 135 gigawatt hours by 2025. Unlike most other battery manufacturers out there, Hithium focuses solely on batteries for stationary storage applications. Why is that?
First of all, thank you for having the chance to speak and introduce Hithium, which has been founded already in 2019. And as you said, we are entering the global market this year. We have raised different offices around the world. Nevertheless, our leadership team has been over a decade already in battery business, coming from one of the largest battery makers. And they think that battery storage is a big enough market, a very much booming market. And for me, even more, it's a missing cornerstone of the successful energy transition. So it would justify the full focus on stationary products. And if you compare it with electric vehicles, which have been driven the high volumes and a lot of standardization in the early days, a battery energy storage system has different requirements. It cares less about weight. It has longer lifetime requirements. We don't need to fit in the chassis of a car, but we need to fit in a 20-foot container. And we are looking after a 1,500 volt system. So when we see today that the batteries for storage systems very much follow the trends or the developments from electric vehicles, we strongly believe there's much room for optimization, and this justifies full focus. And at the end of the day, the products for stationary applications will be different from the batteries which are used in the cars.
In terms of battery energy storage design today?
Can you repeat the question?
Where is the most innovation happening in terms of battery energy storage design today?
Yeah, let me first answer maybe on system level. We see a clear trend from air-cooled systems to liquid-cooled systems. We are as well increasing the capacity per container. We have developed special battery packs, dual-channel compact modules, which allow, instead of having 10 racks in a container, 2 times 6 or 6 double racks, which is increasing the capacity from something of near 3.5 megawatt hours to over 5 megawatt hours on the same 20-foot container. At the same time, we are caring about installation friendliness. The containers are pre-installed, ready to go, as you might say. And last but not least as well, when you look in how containers are placed in the installation environment, there are sometimes space constraints. So we allow in the newer designs as well side-by-side and back-to-back installations, which reduce drastically the space of an energy storage system.
And what are we seeing on the cell level, and how do these innovations reflect on energy density and product cycle life?
When we look down to the cell level, we have had 280 ampere hours in a standard prismatic cell 1.5 years ago, and increasing this in the same size now to 300 ampere hours this year, and end of this year we already reached 314 ampere hours. So the energy density is increased by more than 10%, and at the same time we as well are increasing the life cycles by doing optimizations on the electrolyte, on the anode and cathode materials, and on other electrical components in the battery. So increasing lifetime, increasing energy density on cell level, this is key. And at the other end as well, optimization lead to lower impedance and lower internal losses in the batteries.
Where does Hithium focus its R&D efforts, and where does it see most cost-saving potential in battery manufacturing?
We are just on the way to open a new factory, which is having a very high grade of automation. The speakers before mentioned labor cost, and the new factory has a 30% increase in efficiency on just reducing the amount of labor needed, and a higher grade of automation exceeding the requirements and standards of digital production 3.0. On the other hand, what we will do as well is we optimize this battery cell design, no longer following the electric vehicle standards. This is maybe one of the most exciting news for the industry. As I said, we don't need to fit in the chassis of a car, and we have much more freedom. So we will increase or change the size of the cells for battery energy storage systems, with the target to have less cells in parallel, with lower cost per ampere hour installed, and as said, higher production efficiency. And you might compare this to a development which we had as well in solar some years ago, when in the early days the batteries were following the standards from semiconductors. So wafer sizes were given by a semiconductor industry, and we could only unleash the full power of that solar industry when solar made its own sizes, got bigger, and that as well helped very much to put the cost down. And this is as well one of the big focuses of Hithium. Whatever we do is, at the end of the day, it has to lower the levelized cost of electricity stored.
Absolutely. Thank you, Winfried. This was very informative. We'll see you in a bit in our next panel. Europe's BESS potential is enormous, but not all parts of the continent are equally ripe for BESS investment. In our second panel today, we'll endeavor to survey the European battery investment landscape and pinpoint the hottest markets and revenue opportunities. In addition, we'll discuss the benefits and challenges in co-locating and retrofitting BESS with solar projects, so stay tuned. Joining us on stage again is Winfried Wahl, Senior Director at Hithium Energy Storage, and we have two more expert speakers with us, Stephen Kopeck, Power Director at London-based consultancy Timera Energy, and Ryan Alexander, Research Lead European Power Markets at Aurora Energy Research. Welcome, gentlemen, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Ryan, let's start with you. According to figures from Aurora Energy Research, Europe could hit 42 gigawatts by 2030 and 95 by 2050 of grid-connected utility-scale battery energy storage capacity, and by this we refer to systems of more than 10 megawatt, up from about 5 gigawatt today. So what will be the main drivers behind this growth, and which markets will lead the way?
Yeah, thanks, Marija, and it's a good question. So it kind of depends what time frame we're looking at. If we think out to 2030 and we see where the growth has been in Europe to date, a lot of that growth has been in Great Britain, and that's very much been driven by the availability of or introduction of new ancillary products, so ancillary frequency and balancing products. That's also the case in Ireland, and this is the reason why we've seen substantial build out of batteries in those markets, and particularly Great Britain. Now, In most markets across continental Europe, the level of battery capacity installed is relatively small, and that's changing very rapidly. We see a massive pipeline of projects coming online. And so what we tend to see as a trend across different markets is early movers seem to secure more of their revenues from entering into these frequency markets, bidding in and effectively reaping the benefits of high prices in markets where typically the price setting technology has been a CCGT. And over time, batteries will start to eat into that. And those markets for those products will tend to saturate. As that happens, what we see is a move towards batteries relying on arbitrage as an increasing source of revenue. So effectively buying low, selling high. And that might be not just within wholesale markets and the day-ahead market. It might also be between the day-ahead market and frequency markets. It might also be including the intraday market. So let's say it's getting more sophisticated as we go on, but energy arbitrage is one of the growth drivers of battery storage over the longer term.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll discuss that in more detail later on. Winfried, Hithium established its presence in Europe earlier this year. What are the first impressions in terms of demand, and where do you see most growth potential in Europe?
Yes, I can say the interest in battery storage is really high. There's a lot of requests coming in from, as said, UK as being the most mature market in Europe, but as well Germany, Italy. Eastern Europe, we just signed a contract of a 55 megawatt hour storage system in Bulgaria. We have other pipelines in countries where I think one of the three criteria are alive. One is there's a high installation of solar and wind, where obviously to reach the next step of energy transition, storage could help a lot. Or where the grids are weak, and as well those storage systems can help to balance the demand and production much better, which is mainly true for Eastern Europe. But at the end of the day, as my previous speaker said, it depends a lot of incentive on regulatory framework. At the end of the day, all European markets will need battery storage, and the market is up to boom very soon.
Mm-hmm. Stephen, for investors who want to find good business opportunities here and now, what are the key considerations to take into account? So what's the first advice you give to potential BESS investors?
Well, the first thing that I'd always suggest is to clearly define your risk appetite. So there are a variety of business models with storage, and it can go from a fully merchant business case to one which is much more highly regulated in terms of the return profile. So clearly assessing what level of risk or merchant risk you're willing to contract is really important at the very set off of your project. So particularly you could look at a market, say Italy, with a much higher degree of contracted revenues across the lifetime of the asset via capacity markets and long-term ancillary service contracts. Or you could look to a market more like Germany, which has a much higher degree of merchant exposure, with your principal route to markets being short-term ancillary services or energy arbitrage. The next point would be to embed optionality into your project. So to look both at what the market opportunities are right now, but to understand that how the market evolves over time is going to be really important to understand. And so you want to be able to extend your storage project over time to take into account of different market opportunities as and when they emerge. And then finally, just to really keep a close eye on project capex. We've seen very volatile prices. We've seen some exceptionally high transaction prices and developer premiums in the market. So just to keep an eye on ensuring that your project costs do not run away, because the storage sector has been very exciting, has been really interesting. There's been a lot of interest, and that has pushed up premiums.
All right. And Ryan, to be best positioned to stack revenues, what would be the recommended storage duration for projects being built now?
I guess the answer there, Marija, is it really depends. So what we see when we do dispatch modeling for batteries in different markets is quite different results. And this ultimately is driven by the way that those ancillary products are designed in different markets. For example, the duration of the product, how long you might need to reserve your capacity for. What we see is that In cases where you have a higher reliance on capacity payments, then you have a reduced need for cycling of the asset. You're effectively getting paid to kind of sit there and not necessarily be dispatched. And in those kinds of situations, you might find that there's less of a need for a longer duration battery. Having said that, what we also see is, in markets where they have a higher degree of renewables penetration, particularly solar, during the middle of the day, we find that you do want to have a longer duration battery, maybe not 2 hours, maybe moving towards 4 hours, to be able to capture and maximize the opportunities you have from charging at during those low price periods, and then discharging at other times during the day. And the trade-offs here are quite hard to navigate. Ultimately, it requires doing the modeling to see for different maximum cycling rates, for different degradation rates, for different durations of batteries, what is the optimal sizing for a particular site. And then I haven't mentioned it, but the other question there that's important to consider is, are you co-locating this asset next to a solar asset, for example, that you own yourself, or are you developing a standalone asset? So all of these things having quite a big impact on the optimal duration.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Ryan. And Stephen, we already mentioned the energy arbitrage. Would we say that this is the safest bet in terms of BESS monetization strategies? How predictable is energy arbitrage revenue?
So I think the real thing, the safest bet for securing a profitable business case is to take a strategy agnostic approach. So basically to get yourself set up that you're able to participate in all of these markets. So both the ancillary service markets, any capacity market, if you're eligible in that particular market, but also to make sure that you have a solid route to market provider who is equipped to trade across the intraday markets specifically, because really that's where we see a significant divergence in terms of the profitability and the performance of some of the optimizers, is how good they are at trading across the intraday markets and stacking it with the relevant ancillary services which can be used to support the optimization. In terms of that predictability piece, BESS revenue streams are highly merchant, but that doesn't mean that they're not reliable at all. The wind will always be quite erratic. It's never going to be sunny at night. So you are going to be introducing this structural requirement for storage into the system. And in fact, a lot of the drivers which impact your energy arbitrage returns, so renewable penetration, fuel prices, storage penetration, they also actually impact your ancillary service revenues as well. So you should really be considering both ancillary services and your energy arbitrage revenues as equally merchant in the way that they manifest themselves. But fortunately, we are starting to see financing appear even for those assets which have that high degree of merchant exposure without any fixed revenues. But there are also some markets that are available, such as Italy. I've mentioned other markets include, say, Belgium, with capacity market agreements which have supported some BESS deployment to date, where you can get that greater degree of revenue certainty and can give you a bit more confidence if you require a greater degree of kind of certainty in your business plan and forward revenue.
Mm-hmm. All right. And Winfried, some fear that a high proportion of arbitrage in revenue could spur degradation. Is this correct? And to what extent are the different drivers of the revenue stack interdependent?
Let me say it this way. When you do arbitrage and you maybe target more than one charge and discharge cycle per day, then for sure you run more cycles on the battery. So the calendaric lifetime based on this cycles will be shorter, because you move more energy like you would do if you would just have a co-located thing and would like to make your solar electricity available at night, then you are more running just one cycle a day. So that's true that arbitrage is the challenge of the battery a bit more, and due to the fact you run more of the cycles. The real lifetime and degradation depends on how deep you discharge and at what speed you discharge. And has been said before, I would as well advise to be prepared for multiple revenue stacks, the different models to be applied by the storage. Then, for example, if just 50% of the storage system would do arbitrage and the rest capacity would do something similar at the same time, that is more friendly for the battery than if you would really charge and discharge 0 to 100% and at maximum speed, which is the most stressful battery. That's true.
Yeah, very important considerations, of course. Ryan, we already mentioned capacity market auctions. Where can investors find most substantial backing through such mechanisms in Europe?
So what we've seen is across Europe, the capacity market payments, they differ a lot by country. These are very much nationally determined market designs. And what we've seen is, for example, Poland being a market that has quite high clearing prices for batteries. It also, at least for now, has relatively low derating factors for batteries. So this is an example of where, if you're in that market at the right time and you secure one of those long-term contracts in the Polish CM, that can really set you up. And we've seen that can be, compared to other markets, quite a big driver of the revenues for a battery there. But I wouldn't limit this exclusively to capacity markets, because the other trend that we're seeing right now, which is quite astounding really, is the amount of public support that's flowing to batteries in battery-specific auctions. So a lot of this funding is coming from the EU level through the Corona Recovery and Resilience Facility. And that funding has supported auctions in Greece. It's supporting them, as we've just seen results announced in Spain. And we're talking about a lot of money in the form of either CapEx or operating subsidy support payments, or both. And these contracts are there providing a market entrant with quite a substantial amount of support, and that's on top of potentially capacity market payments. Now that funding is limited. We're not going to see that forever, but it certainly gives some kinds of developers the opportunity to enter into one of these markets without facing the merchant exposure that they otherwise would.
Yes, sure. And Winfried, Ryan already mentioned early mover advantages. Some investors and developers may be prone to postponing their BESS projects in anticipation of lower battery prices that we discussed in our first panel today. But do they also risk joining too late when the market gets crowded and revenues decline?
I think so. One of the things, maybe a lot of people underestimate that building a battery energy storage system, maybe together as well with production, is much more complicated than putting solar on a greenfield. They require mid-voltage transformers, you require inverters, and you require a software integration to control and tell the battery what it should do at what time. And I would give those who do the first projects now to learn with the target to be able to copy and paste the design which they have put at one location later on. I would clearly say the ones who are doing the first moves now would have a clear advantage, because the learning how to install and operate batteries is not so straightforward than putting a simple PV system somewhere.
And with that, we can already move to our next topic, and this is co-location. Winfried, so for those who want to co-locate their PV projects with battery storage, what should be considered in the first line?
As it has been said before, I mean, everybody has to make clear about his business case, what the battery at the end of the day should do. Whether the main goal is to for example, put more solar generation while the grid is weak and put it to the grid at a later stage, use the battery as a buffer. You could as well consider the battery to be used for the self-consumption of the devices which are going standby at night and not to source that electricity from the grid. But if you want to actively participate in the energy market, then the sizing will be different. So they should to make the business case at the very first level is a good step forward. And on the other hand as well, a battery is a big and bulky item, which is a heavy transport. So we have to make sure that this heavy devices as well can reach to the place of a solar and wind installation, where sometimes the roads are not at that quality which would be required to support heavy transport.
And Stephen, is it easier to achieve return on investment on a standalone battery system or when co-located with PV?
Well, the business case of the two models is fundamentally pretty similar. So you'll have access to similar revenue streams whether you're co-located or standalone in most markets. The key drivers then for co-location are potentially having a lower overall project capex and also potentially having quicker access to the grid via piggybacking on an existing site and an existing grid connection. So that does mean that co-located systems can achieve higher returns than standalone, but it's not necessarily guaranteed. And you really need to ensure that you're sizing the battery correctly in order not to overly curtail your potential revenues. And you also really need to be considering whether there are any other changes to the business case which will impact your costs of operation. So particularly here, things around grid tariffs. So your grid tariffs treatment could be different under a market where you're a standalone system or a co-located system. And that's particularly things around your charges that you might be levied on any power that's imported from the grid. And then you also need to consider whether you're allowed to import any power from the grid. So under a number of schemes in Europe, if you were to co-locate a storage system with renewables, your ability to actually withdraw power directly from the grid is restricted, and you're only allowed to charge directly from the on-site renewable generation. That limits what you can do with your battery. And so in those instances, we might actually expect a lower rate of return for a co-located system. So there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's not a single yes, but if done well, then co-location can absolutely improve your project returns in storage.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. So Ryan, as Stephen just mentioned, these grid constraints, which European markets are the most favorable ones for PV plus BESS co-location?
So yeah, that's a good question. What we see, and I would say maybe it's not just limited to the constraints around charging, discharging, but there are also some other kinds of considerations that make a certain market more attractive than others. So, for example, what we see in I'll take Portugal as an example. Generally, a bunch of reasons why batteries there might not make sense, but one of the favourable things there is that the permitting regime allows an owner of an existing solar asset to put a battery onto the property without having to apply for a new permit for land use, and that's something which already removes one risk out of the development process. Having said that, we see quite favourable co-location environment, let's say, for batteries in Italy. It's certainly an emerging and interesting market there. Spain also, lots of interest. And in Germany, Stephen just mentioned it. So, the innovation auctions in Germany are an example of an instrument whereby a battery can't charge from the grid. It needs to charge from the solar asset if it's securing the subsidy under the innovation auction scheme. So, what we'll see is these kinds of regulatory hurdles starting to create some distinctions between which markets are, let's say, more favourable or less favourable for co-location.
Yes, absolutely. And Winfried, how does co-locating or retrofitting PV projects with BESS change the business case for the PV side?
Yeah, as it has been said before, I mean, what you can avoid is that some part of the electricity you produce cannot be sold because of some limitations to the grid. If you buffer this to a storage, it can help. as well said that maybe some of the self-consumption of society can be sourced from the battery instead of putting it from a grid. But these two things alone might not justify a bigger battery to be placed. So it has to be really well thought through what kind of business models are possible to co-locate with solar, which is, as said, as well quite similar to put it anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And Stephen, when co-locating or retrofitting, what should be considered not to limit the merchant opportunities for batteries?
So the key thing around the merchant opportunities is first to ensure, obviously, that you are able to import directly from the grid, as I said before, but also the sizing of the battery. So here we're talking about sizing with relation to the size of the battery in both megawatt and megawatt hour terms relative to the size of the on-site renewable generation and relative to the size of your grid export connection. So when your renewables are generating, you are effectively curtailing the ability of your battery to export power and sell it to the grid. Now, the cost of that depends very much on the ratio of your solar PV and your BESS, but also on the market dynamics. So in some markets, you'll find that where there's already a high degree of solar penetration, power prices will be depressed across the periods of peak solar generation. And so the cost associated with that curtailment might be lower. Whereas in some markets whereby you have less solar penetration, actually the middle of the day hours across the summer can coincide with high market power prices. And so the cost of that curtailment would be greater. So you really need to run multiple stochastic valuations of different sizing configurations to understand the impact of that sort of sizing on your potential revenue. And it's important to note that it impacts not just your day ahead revenues, which typically have a fairly clear relationship between solar PV and power price, but also the ancillary service revenues and the intraday market revenues, where the correlations between solar PV and power prices and ancillary clearing prices can be much more complicated to model and can be more erratic. So you need to consider the impact of the different sizing ratios across all of the different revenue streams which you'll be looking to monetize.
Absolutely. And Ryan, we already mentioned some regulatory and grid hurdles that co-locating and retrofitting projects can encounter. But nonetheless, do we expect a big growth in the number of such installations in Europe in the years to come?
Absolutely, Marija. I keep saying to everyone that will listen that we'll all be co-location experts in a couple of years, because what we're seeing is batteries to date have been kind of a niche investment opportunity, particularly for equity funds looking for high returns. Now, as we're seeing the product itself standardize and become cheaper, it's becoming more accessible across the kind of environment of investors. And what that means is that, a regular renewables developer is increasingly interested in how a battery business model can work, how it can improve the returns on an existing solar plant, and also how it can help to mitigate risks that you might face as the owner of a solar plant in terms of cannibalization risk, being able to offer a more firm profile to anyone who's looking to offtake via a PPA. So these kinds of considerations, I think, are making everyone think more about batteries. And now that we're seeing the barriers to batteries coming down from a grid, permitting regulatory perspective in many markets, our expectation is that we're going to see co-location, at some point becoming increasingly standard across many markets. But we're not there yet, and we're all on the same journey, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And with that, I think this is a great place to wrap up for today. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for sharing your insights and expertise with us. These were Winfried Wahl, Senior Director at Hithium Energy Storage, Stephen Kopak, Power Director at Timira Energy, and Ryan Alexander, Research Lead European Power Markets at Aurora Energy Research. Thanks to our speakers, but also big thanks, of course, to our audience. And stay tuned. Up next is our hydrogen session, and we'll be back after a short break, during which you have the chance for some speed networking or to meet some of the speakers and sponsors in the expo area. Until then, I'm Marija Maisch, editor at PV Magazine Global, and this is Roundtables Europe 2023.